Valerie Bertinelli was once America's sweetheart, a beloved actress married to one of the most electrifying guitarists who ever lived. For 26 years, the public saw a love story. Fan mail poured in by the thousands. Magazine covers called them rock and roll's perfect couple. But inside that marriage, something was quietly breaking. The money was disappearing. The silence was growing. And the truth Valerie finally spoke out loud was something Eddie's own camp never wanted the world to hear. It was 1980. Valerie Bertinelli was 19 years old, still playing the wholesome daughter on One Day at a Time, one of the most watched sitcoms on American television at the time. She had a clean, approachable image, the kind of face that made people feel safe. Eddie Van Halen was the opposite of safe. By 1980, Van Halen's debut album had already sold over 10 million copies. The band was touring relentlessly, pulling in an estimated $50,000 per night, a staggering figure for a rock act at that stage of their career. Eddie wasn't just popular. He had rewritten what a guitar could do. Critics and musicians alike were calling him a once-in-a-generation talent. He was loud, brilliant, and completely unpredictable. They met backstage after a concert. By most accounts, the connection was immediate, the kind that doesn't leave much room for careful thinking. They married in April 1981. The wedding was kept relatively small, but the media attention was anything but. Two worlds had collided, Hollywood and hard rock, and the public couldn't get enough. Fan mail flooded in. Photographers camped outside. The narrative wrote itself. The girl next door and the guitar god, somehow finding each other. The early years, friends later said, had a genuine warmth to them. Chaotic, yes, but real. And yet, according to Bertinelli's own 2008 memoir Losing It, the warning signs were already there, not buried, not hidden, just overlooked. Eddie's drinking was an established pattern before the wedding even happened. Not a phase, not stress, a pattern. Bertinelli wrote about it with striking clarity, not with anger, but with the calm honesty of someone who had finally stopped pretending. She saw it. She knew what it was. And she said yes anyway. The memoir doesn't fully explain why. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe some decisions don't come with clean reasons. She saw the warning signs before the wedding, but stayed for 20 more years. What would you have done in her position? Drop your answer below. The numbers looked extraordinary from the outside. Through the 1980s, Van Halen became one of the highest-grossing rock acts in the world. According to Billboard industry estimates from that era, the band generated over $100 million in touring revenue across the decade alone. Arenas sold out. Merchandise moved by the truckload. The Van Halen name was everywhere. But revenue and wealth are not the same thing. The financial structure surrounding a band of that size was layered and complex. Management fees, production costs, label splits, and touring overhead consumed enormous portions of what came in at the top. Eddie, for all his commercial power, often had limited direct control over the actual cash flow. The machine ran around him as much as it ran because of him. What reached his hands personally was a fraction of what the headline suggested. At home, Bertinelli kept working. She took on television roles steadily through the 1980s, though her career had naturally slowed from the heights of her One Day at a Time years. She wasn't struggling, but she was no longer the household name she'd been at 17. The industry had moved on in the way it always does with young actresses. Quietly, without announcement. In 1991, their son Wolfgang was born. By multiple accounts, that birth brought something back into the house. A temporary steadiness. A shared focus. People close to the couple described a period where things felt, if not repaired, at least paused. Eddie was present in a way he hadn't always been. For a time, it held. It didn't last. By the early 1990s, Eddie's alcohol and drug use had escalated significantly, not gradually, but in the way these things tend to accelerate when left unaddressed for years. In her memoir, Bertinelli described specific nights of sitting alone, waiting, with no message and no explanation. Eddie would disappear for hours. She wouldn't know where he was. She'd sit with that silence and find a way to absorb it. Then she'd get up the next morning and go to work. In 1995, People magazine ran an interview with Bertinelli. She smiled. She gave warm, carefully worded answers. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would raise concern. Looking back at that interview now, it reads like a performance, not out of deception, but out of survival. She had learned, somewhere along the way, to make the outside match what people needed to see. The inside was a different story entirely. In 2001, after 20 years of marriage, Valerie Bertinelli and Eddie Van Halen separated. There was no public announcement, no dramatic press statement, no tabloid war. They simply stopped. And for a long time, the world barely noticed. That quiet was deliberate. Both parties, by all accounts, made a conscious choice to keep the legal process out of the headlines. It worked. While the separation happened in 2001, the divorce was not formally finalized until 2007, a 6-year process that moved slowly, largely without public scrutiny, which in Hollywood is its own kind of achievement. Court records from the Los Angeles Superior Court confirm the proceedings involved substantial asset negotiation, 2 decades of shared finances, property, and a life built around one of rock's most recognizable names. Untangling that takes time, and it takes lawyers. The specific settlement figures were sealed, meaning the exact financial terms never became public record. What stayed behind closed doors stayed there. But Bertinelli, when she finally did speak, didn't lead with the finances. What she described was something harder to quantify. In a 2008 interview with Today, she said she had lost herself completely inside the marriage. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, across years, she had reorganized her entire sense of self around managing someone else's chaos. By the time the separation came, she wasn't sure who she was outside of it. That kind of loss doesn't show up in court documents. Eddie, meanwhile, moved forward at a pace that surprised many observers. Within months of the divorce being finalized in 2007, he was engaged. In June 2009, he married actress Janie Lashevsky, less than 2 years after the ink dried on the legal separation from Bertinelli. For people who had followed the marriage closely, the speed felt significant. It raised questions about timelines, about what had been happening, and when. Bertinelli addressed it only indirectly in interviews. A careful word here. A knowing pause there. She never accused. She never confirmed. But she never fully deflected either. What she chose not to say publicly about those 6 years, it turns out, was far more revealing than what she did. What she chose not to say publicly about those 6 years is coming, and it changes everything you thought you knew about this marriage. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. When Losing It hit shelves in February 2008, it didn't ease its way into the conversation. It debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in its first week. By the end of its first year, the memoir had sold over 500,000 copies. For a book rooted in personal confession rather than celebrity spectacle, those numbers were remarkable. Readers weren't just buying it, they were talking about it, passing it to friends, underlining passages. The reason wasn't hard to find. Bertinelli didn't write the kind of memoir that softens everything into a redemption arc. She wrote with specificity. She wrote about her own struggles with food and weight that had tracked her entire adult life, about a self-worth that had quietly eroded across decades, and about what it actually looked like to live alongside someone in active addiction, not in abstract terms, but in real, documented moments. She described Eddie allegedly being high during significant milestones in Wolfgang's childhood, moments that couldn't be recovered, moments that existed now only as absences in the family record. She wrote about finances that had been mismanaged during the later touring years, money that should have represented security, gone in ways that were never fully explained. And she described an emotional detachment that hadn't arrived suddenly with the separation. It had been calcifying for years, long before any legal document made it official. This was not a tell-all designed to wound. The tone was measured, but the details were precise enough to land. The Van Halen camp responded, not directly, and not on the record. Instead, unnamed associates began giving quotes to entertainment outlets, suggesting Bertinelli was reshaping history to serve a narrative. That she was exaggerating. That she was cashing in. The pushback was coordinated enough to be noticeable, but careful enough to be deniable. No one attached their name to it. Bertinelli didn't flinch. In interview after interview, she held her position without escalating. She wasn't interested in a war of competing accounts. Her argument was straightforward. She could only speak to what she had lived. Her memory. Her experience. Her record. If others remembered it differently, that was their account to give. What she didn't do was also significant. According to a 2008 Entertainment Weekly profile, Bertinelli turned down 3 separate offers to appear on reality television during this period. In an era when celebrity reality shows were at their commercial peak, that kind of offer represented serious money and serious exposure. She said no 3 times. It was a quiet decision, made without fanfare, but it sent a clear signal about what she was and wasn't willing to trade her story for. Credibility, it turned out, was the one thing she wasn't selling. The book had opened a door. And now that it was open, there was no closing it, not for Bertinelli, and not for the people who had spent years managing the public image of Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020. He was 65 years old. The cause was throat cancer, a disease he had been fighting for over a decade. He had first disclosed the diagnosis back in 2000, which meant the illness had tracked the last 20 years of his life quietly, in the background, while the world went on debating his legacy and his catalog. When the news broke, Bertinelli responded within hours. She posted a public tribute. In it, she called Eddie the greatest love of her life. That phrase landed differently than most celebrity condolences do. People noticed it, because anyone who had read her memoir, anyone who had followed the interviews, anyone who understood even the broad outline of what that marriage had cost her, they knew that phrase was not simple. It was not a publicist's language. It was something more complicated than grief, and more honest than closure. It surprised people. It was meant to. Privately, the response was harder. Sources close to Bertinelli told People magazine in late 2020 that his death had reopened something she believed she had already worked through. Grief that had been filed away, processed, set down, suddenly wasn't. The emotional distance that divorce creates, that clean separation of lives and futures, collapsed without warning. He was gone. And gone is a different category than over. Wolfgang, their son, was publicly devastated. He had spent the final years of his father's life not just as a son but as a bandmate, playing bass in Van Halen's last active lineup, traveling with him, being present in a way that few people get to be with a dying parent. That closeness made the loss total. For Wolfgang, there was no compartment to put it in. For Bertinelli, the grief took a shape that was harder to explain publicly. A lot of people know what it's like to grieve someone who's still alive, or to mourn a relationship long before it officially ends. If that's ever been you, you already understand exactly what Valerie was carrying. Throughout 2021, she returned to this in interviews, the experience of mourning someone twice. Once while they were still living, across all those years of distance and disappointment and love that had nowhere clean to go. And then again, finally, when they were actually gone. She described it as a psychological doubling, 2 losses occupying the same space, neither one canceling the other out. The response was significant. Her posts about Eddie's death generated over 2 million social media engagements. Not because people were looking for celebrity drama, but because what she was describing was recognizable. The grief of complicated love. The grief that doesn't come with a straightforward script. The divorce papers had said the marriage was over. But the story, it turned out, had never fully closed. And now, with Eddie gone, there was no possibility of the ending changing. Whatever had been left unresolved between them would stay that way. That realization, for Bertinelli, was its own kind of reckoning. Something shifted in Valerie Bertinelli around 2022. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't announced. But anyone who had followed her for years could see it. Her social media presence, which had grown to over 3 million followers across platforms, began to change in tone. The carefully composed posts gave way to something more direct. Videos filmed without much production. Thoughts shared without the usual editorial layer. She wasn't performing warmth anymore. She was just talking. And what she was saying was different. She spoke openly about her second marriage to financial analyst Tom Vitale, a relationship that had lasted 11 years before ending in 2022. But she didn't frame it as a separate chapter, a fresh mistake, a different story. She drew a direct line. The patterns she had lived with Eddie, the emotional caretaking, the constant recalibration of her own needs to accommodate someone else's instability, she recognized them again in what had come after. Same architecture, different person. That recognition, she said, was the most unsettling part. She began using specific language. Codependency, trauma bonding, emotional conditioning. These weren't therapy buzzwords she was deploying casually. She was naming, with precision, the psychological framework that had quietly organized 40 years of her adult life. Loving someone in addiction, she explained, doesn't just affect the years you're in it. It rewires how you relate to people long after. It teaches you that love requires management, that your job is to absorb, to stabilize, to perform okayness, so that someone else doesn't fall apart. She had learned that lesson young, and she had kept applying it, without fully realizing it, ever since. In January 2023, she appeared on The Drew Barrymore Show. The conversation became a turning point, not because of any single revelation, but because of the way she delivered it. No hedging. No softening. She stated plainly that she had spent decades prioritizing other people's comfort over her own truth. She didn't apologize for saying it. She didn't walk it back with a joke or a smile. She just let it sit there. The response from mental health professionals was immediate. Experts quoted in both Healthline and Psychology Today that same year pointed to Bertinelli's account as a textbook real-world illustration of long-term trauma bonding, the process by which repeated cycles of tension, crisis, and reconciliation create emotional attachments that are genuinely difficult to distinguish from love. Her story wasn't just relatable. It was clinically recognizable. For decades, the public had watched Bertinelli smile through things. Smile through the marriage. Smile through the memoir tour. Smile through the grief. She was good at it. Exceptionally good. The smile had been its own kind of armor. By 2023, the armor was off. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She didn't spend her platform relitigating the past or assigning blame to the people who were no longer there to respond. What she offered instead was something rarer, a clear-eyed account of how someone can lose themselves incrementally, across years, without a single dramatic moment to point to. No explosion. No defining crisis. Just a slow, quiet erosion that happens when you spend long enough putting everyone else first. The girl who had once smiled from every magazine cover had finally stopped performing. And the audience, the millions who had followed her since she was a teenager on a sitcom, who had bought the memoir, who had watched the interviews, who had sent the comments, had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for exactly this version of her. Valerie Bertinelli finally stopped softening the truth. But the patterns she described, the decades of emotional caretaking, the quiet erasure of self, those don't begin with fame. We'll show you exactly where they start in our next video.